Welcome to another episode of Facts. I'm your host, Stephen Boyce. We're doing an episode on the Pastoral Epistles today. One of the things I wanted to key in on is that I've been on a couple of programs just in the last couple of weeks, including just 2 days ago, discussing this very subject. It's one that's become very important to me because the traction in it in the atheistic and the skeptic and the Christian movements are all having these conversations at once. So I figured, why not share with my own channel? I'm sharing it with everybody else's channel. And I have slides to those that are watching this on YouTube. To those who are going to be following this on the podcast, I will read them slowly, as I always say. Sorry that you don't have the visual. If you'd like the visual, you can obviously leave the podcast side of it after you're done listening and go back and see some of these. You could also reach out to me. I am totally fine with sending these to people if they want them. The notes and the things like that. I have people do this to me all the time. It is not a burden for me to send you notes. If you ever want these things, just hit me up on social media somewhere and I'll send you an email if you share that with me. One of the reasons I think this is an important discussion, because this is a part of the broader discussion of the New Testament. Do we trust the early attestation of the documents? Or do we continue to believe that we've been delusional and just accept anything that is thrown at us? And that when we go through these things, now we can say, oh, well, since the post-Enlightenment, we have better knowledge of stuff than they did then, with materials that we've lost in history, people that we have no writings from, traditions that can only be preserved in a small fragmented way. Are we saying that we have more than what they had then? Are we saying that we know more than those who were at the same time in the same timeline as these people? I think it's an arrogant thing. I really do. I'm not saying we haven't learned things. I'm not saying that we haven't discovered things that went missing for a long time. But when we're dealing with the New Testament text, these were not disputed. What we're talking about today were not disputed. The only one that brought any kind of question to these was not on the basis of whether or not they knew Paul wrote them, but rather on the basis of these do not work with my theology, and therefore I'm not going to accept them in my corpus. So these are the things that we're going to look at. I'm going to use some slides to help us do this today. I'll go ahead and bring them onto the stage. We're going to ask the question, did Paul write the Pastoral Epistles? And then we're going to answer the question by looking at the internal and external data as to whether or not this is the case. So let's do our typical routine. Anytime we do an episode and we go through these things, we look at the historical attestation, its testimony, and we'll see what we can come up with. So Irenaeus of Lyons. Irenaeus is one of my favorite church fathers into the 2nd century. He's writing particularly about the bishopric in this first quote that I have for you. And he's writing about those who succeeded St. Peter in Rome. And he mentions particularly Linus at this point. But he also brings in a pastoral epistle while mentioning the person named Linus. He says, quote, "The blessed apostles then, having founded and built up the church, committed into the hands of Linus the office of the episcopate. Of this Linus, Paul makes mention in his epistle to Timothy." And obviously that's referring to 2 Timothy 4:21. Now, I just recently did an entire episode on St. Linus. You can go back in the archives just a few weeks and you'll run into that episode there as we looked at some of the earliest founders and pillars of the See of Rome, if you would, after Peter. But one of the places Irenaeus giving us a succession list mentions that Paul had talked about Linus of Rome when he wrote a letter to Timothy. So in an immediate reaction, Irenaeus, who's in the school of St. John through Polycarp, has the tradition of this letter, its names, its list, and already recognizes it as from Paul. In another place, he says, "And Polycarp himself replied to Marcion, who met him on one occasion and said, 'Do you know me? I do know you, the firstborn of Satan.' Such was the horror which the apostles and their disciples had against holding even verbal communication with any corrupters of the truth. As Paul also says, a man that is a heretic After the first and second admonition, reject, knowing that he is such is subverted in sins and being condemned of himself. So this is an interesting point right here. He's dealing with Marcion, and a statement of him was that his mentor, Irenaeus' mentor, ran into Marcion. So Polycarp and Marcion apparently crossed paths. Now we know that there were stories that Irenaeus has preserved for us through the recollection of Polycarp about St. John. And that John had ran into, particularly Cerinthus, who started the early form of Gnosticism, which was called Cerinthianism. And then he's recollecting another story about Polycarp himself running into the middle of the 2nd century heretic Marcion. Now, Polycarp, when you read the letter that he wrote to the Philippians, seems like a really grandfatherly, kind man. But when he ran into the heretic Marcion, he calls him the firstborn of Satan, which is quite powerful and really accusative in that sense. But he also recollects this, not only about the story, but why Polycarp treated him in that manner. And he says that Paul teaches, and Paul said, that if a man is a heretic, if you have given some sort of confrontation to them after the first and second attempt, reject them. They're in their sin and they're condemning themselves. So he believes, and by the way, that's coming from Titus 3:10, at least from Irenaeus, 2 Timothy and Titus are from the writings of Paul. The Muratorian fragment, I think, becomes one of the most important testimonies here. It's a difficult date other than the fact that we have good reason internally to put it at the end of the 2nd century. Many have given it the date between 170 and 200. I'm comfortable in that lane. I have no problem with that date at all. But it kind of goes through the epistles of Paul, and it gives these teachings of which letters he wrote. And in fact, it even goes through the different churches that he wrote to, the Corinthians and then Ephesians and Philippians. But I want to draw your attention to that which is underlined here. He separates the general corporate epistles from the personal epistles that he wrote. Now, this became a really interesting thought for me that about 3 years ago now, I started a study on the statement from the Muratorian fragment to kind of see maybe if we're doing this wrong. Maybe if modern scholarship that is rejecting this simply on the basis of syntax and vocabulary, that we're starting at the wrong point and we're comparing it to the wrong things. But know what the Muratorian fragment says. Paul also wrote out of affection and love, 1 to Philemon, 1 to Titus, 2 to Timothy. And these are held sacred in the esteem of the universal church for the regulation of the ecclesiastical discipline. So before I continue reading the Muratorian fragment, here's what needs to be noted. He speaks about 3 total people with a combination of 4 letters who received affectionate and loving letters. Meaning the disposition of Paul was different in these as compared to those he just listed, like those to the Corinthians and the one to Galatians and the one to the Romans and so forth. So he's already presented these general corporate letters, and then he pulls aside the pastorals and then one more, Philemon. And he says that he wrote these out of affection and love, which we should expect that to look a little bit different. We should expect the tone and the style and the vocabulary to change. And I'm going to give examples of that and show you research where I've done that. But he also says that these were held as sacred and esteemed to the universal church for the regulation of church discipline. He's saying, whoever wrote this, probably in Rome, that the church universal has already received these as Pauline. By the end of the 2nd century, Irenaeus, the Muratorian fragment, has already recognized the pastoral epistles not only as Pauline, but as used by the churches universal to deal with problems in matters of discipline by allowing this authority through Paul and these epistles to bring about the proper needs of either repentance, rebuke, or some sort of instruction, utilizing these letters to do that. It would be one thing if the churches in the East have ascribed these letters to another person like Barnabas or somebody like Clement or somebody like Silas, and then others in the West or in North Africa are saying, no, this is Paul. Or it'd be one thing if the churches in Jerusalem and Antioch say, we don't have any record of these. And then over here in North Africa, they're saying, well, we do. These are Paul's. These were universally received as Paul and authoritative from Paul from the very, very beginning. Now, why is that important? Because we need to remember, these were not the only writings circulating in the church designated to the name of Paul. Notice what the Muratorian fragment goes on to say. There is current also, catch it, current, an epistle to the Laodiceans. By the way, we have fragmented forms of this letter. We have fragmented sections of what we believe this letter is. And it's really not that different. I mean, it's not majorly heretical in content if it's the same letter the Muratorian fragment is referring to. Could be a different one. Why not just go ahead and throw Paul on that? So, well, let's just add to Paul's corpus here. Let's continue to build Paul's letters and legacy. Let's just keep going and add these two. Why is it that Paul's letter to the Laodiceans, which there's cause to believe that there was such a possible letter if you take the words of Colossians 4 and you take them very, very literally, and that he says that there was a letter written to them. So if that's the case, why not, if the churches are conspirators and trying to pull some sort of fast one on everybody, insert that one and say, see, we've got the letter that Colossians was talking about with Paul's name on it to the Laodiceans. We've got them both. The churches know it exists. Why don't they accept it? See, this is for kicks and giggles. I don't think the churches are messing around. I think they're protecting the text as they receive them. And the churches are maintaining these. And that would make perfect sense. Titus was in Crete. Timothy was in Ephesus, but had major contacts and connections with the church of Corinth, the church of Ephesus, and different portions of Paul's ministry as he went back and forth between these different places like Colossae. So here is a person who had prominence in the East, who's in the West writing these letters. It would make sense that these were preserved by the churches connected to Paul, which is a broad group of churches. And so that when even one comes in with his name on it, they know it's not him, like the letter to the Laodiceans. Here's another one, another to the Alexandrians, both forged in the name of Paul for furthering the heresy of Marcion. How in the world do they know that? There's also the Acts of Paul. There's the Apocalypse of Paul, and I can go on and on. There's a lot of names designated with Paul. There's a lot of letters with the name Paul designated to it that the churches were saying this is a forgery. They knew what a Pauline forgery was and what an authentic letter of Paul was. They knew these things. They were in the know more than us. This is the question I asked earlier at the beginning of this program. Are we here to say that we have got this figured out better than them? That those who knew the apostles, that those that were a part of the churches of the apostles somehow knew how to say this is forgery. This is a corruption. These are genuine. Not just in a church, not just in a town, not just in a city, not just in a country, not just in a continent, but the universal church universally maintained these as Pauline. Some agenda. Also, Tertullian against Marcion, Book 5, states this: to this epistle, Philemon, alone did its brevity have failed to protect it against the falsifying hands of Marcion. Okay, now here's Marcion again. Now remember, Marcion took the Lucan work of the gospel, mutilated it, according to Tertullian. And now all the skeptics and atheists think that Marcion is actually the true first form, and the Luke we have is off of Marcion, which is ridiculous, of course. The churches, again, were on guard for these things. This is why Irenaeus and Tertullian, not even in the same place, same continent, are writing against the corruptions that are going on. Even the Muratorian fragment. Rome, on the other hand, is also dealing with the corruption of what Marcion had done. There is an entire document called the Anti-Marcionite Prologue. The churches were on high alert. I was just talking to someone who's struggling with the reliability of the New Testament just yesterday. In fact, he's in England. And one of the things that he brought up is, how do we know these kinds of questions are realities? I said, when you look at the church, they were very cautious about what they let in and what they sent out. When Jerome wrote a commentary of the Psalms, not long after, somebody on the other side of the sea had already started stealing the material and corrupting it. Someone sent word back to Jerome. Jerome writes an entire treatise against the person, knew where, who it was, and what they said. How? And that's not even like a biblical text. It's not like they were corrupting one of the Gospels or Acts or one of Paul's letters or one of Peter's letters. They were corrupting his commentary on the Psalms. The churches were on high alert. So here's another example. He's talking about the Epistle Philemon. Even though it's brief, it's short, Marcion was able to get his hands on a lot of Paul's letters. But then he kind of wonders to himself. He says, I wonder, however, when he received this letter, which was written but to one man, that he rejected the two epistles to Timothy and the one to Titus, which all treat of ecclesiastical discipline. There it is again, similar to what we just read in the Muratorian fragment. His aim was, I suppose, to carry out his interpolating process even to the number of Paul's epistles. So he's questioning why Marcion didn't touch these. There must be of a different nature. They're written to individuals. They have a disciplinary side to them. So once again, Tertullian attributes these to Paul, noting that Marcion didn't corrupt them, but maintain the others. Now, this is where the argument on the other side comes in and says, wait a minute, doesn't that show that he knew they weren't Paul if he was only going after Paul? Well, no, not necessarily. That's not necessarily the case. Marcion did not go after Luke and Acts. He just went after Luke. Does that mean he didn't think Acts was written by the same author? I don't know any atheists or skeptics today that hardly deny the writer of one is the writer of the other. Of course, they deny it's Luke, but they don't really deny that the first writer of Acts or of Luke is the same one that wrote Acts. So I don't buy that way of thinking because it's inconsistent with how everything else was handled and what Marcion did. Origen said this in his commentary of Matthew. He said, on the second letter to Timothy, quote, some have dared to reject this epistle, but they were not able. So Origen saying there is a letter, and he was talking about the second one to Timothy. People have tried to turn this letter away, and they weren't able to do it because it was so attested by these churches, as I stated earlier and read from the Muratorian fragment. Now, the reason Origen likely said this was due to Clement writing on Gnosticism in the Stromata, Book 2. Quote, as then, philosophy has been brought into evil repute by pride and self-conceit. So also gnosis, which simply means knowledge, a false gnosis called by the same name of which the apostle writing says, already establishes Paul, the same writer as Romans in chapter 6, O Timothy, keep that which is committed to your trust, avoiding the profane and vain babblings and oppositions of knowledge falsely called, which some professing have erred concerning the faith. That's quoting 1 Timothy 6:20 and 21. Convicted by this utterance, the heretics reject the epistles to Timothy. Why? Because he's calling them out. Now, herein lies one of the major issues as well as we discuss this. One of the arguments is, well, this is second century terminology, Gnosticism is being docked here. Let me just say this in the nicest possible way. I hear what people say in regards to this on a regular basis. One of the things that continually comes up as it relates to, oh, this is second century and it's clearly language that Paul has borrowed from the second century. No, here's the thing. I have spent many, many hours on the second century patristics and looking at that which they combat in the Gnostic realm. In fact, I just finished an article that should be releasing any day now from Second Clement, which attacks the idea of Docetism. Ignatius of Antioch in the early part of the second century combats ideas of Docetism. What is combated in what's called knowledge in the writing of Paul to Timothy is not the same thing that is being battled in the second century. In fact, if you look at the things that they're going after, if you look at the things that are being attacked in the second century writings, whether you're talking about the things around the time of Justin Martyr, the writing of Second Clement, or the earlier part of the century, or you're talking about Irenaeus, or you're looking at Ignatius of Antioch, or the letter of Diognetus, when you're looking at the theology of Gnosticism at that point, from the earliest parts, and then you go in and you start studying like the Gospel of Thomas, or the Gospel of Mary, or the Gospel of Truth, or the Gospel of Judas, which are second century forgeries that are completely Gnosticizing what was in the New Testament already and taking its own content and corrupting it to its theology. That theology that everybody is saying is in 1st and 2nd Timothy is nowhere close to what Paul was refuting in those letters that the early church fathers in the 2nd century are combating in the documents that we have of the Gnostic text. Not even close. Just because there is a proto-Gnostic rise in the letter of Paul does not mean in any way, shape, or form that these are second century documents. And I'm going to show in a minute why that's not even possible. We have first century quotes of the pastorals. But keep in mind, the rise of Gnosticism began with certain conceptual thoughts that were happening apparently at the very end of Paul's life that started taking a greater root by the time the Apostle John in the later end of the 1st century is writing, where he does hit Cerinthianisms and forms of that teaching. Cerinthus was going around in the end of the 1st century creating havoc in the time of Paul's life. Really more in John, but probably also at the beginning conception of Paul. We don't know. But the idea of Gnostic theology being like this secluded 2nd century thing is not the case. And if we actually take the prominent view of the 2nd century Gnosticism, which is particularly Docetism, that's not really found in the language of 1st and 2nd Timothy or Titus. It is very much found in the language at the beginning of the 2nd century in Ignatius of Antioch when dealing with the Eucharist and saying, who would deny the body and blood of Christ in the Eucharist? Oh, heretics, because they believed physical matter was evil. Cerinthus didn't necessarily have that view. Slightly different. Now, what Paul's combating is not that form of Gnosticism. So, these are 2nd century based on that is incorrect. The Gnostic view was developing. It had reached its peak in the 2nd century. And Paul was not combating something full force from the 2nd century the way that is perceived and that those have inserted on this. Let me also add this one in there as well. Another specific place where somebody says, well, this is 2nd century language is where in Paul's instruction to Timothy in his first letter, he speaks about women. And he speaks about how they should not be authorities over men, speaking of the priesthood, those that are bishops or those that are priests, those that are in the clergy are not to be that of women. And he speaks why through the creation narrative. Now, it's funny on two ends. You have the Christian side trying to excuse that and saying, well, Paul was just under the pressure of society and he was just following the societal norms of the day. And he made that argument because it would have been unsafe to let women be priests. I'm sorry, women priestesses was a normal thing in Paul's day. Any pagan practice had women priestesses all the way back to the very ancient cultures of the ancient Near East had women priestesses all the time practicing and doing some sort of sometimes spells, magicians, sacrifices, etc. These things were regular. Let's not play that game. Let's not go there. That's not reality. Okay. Second thing about that, Paul also goes back and starts at the creation narrative for this decision, not a cultural argument. It's a creation argument, not a cultural argument. I did 2 entire episodes on women in the ordination process of priesthood and bishopric. You can find those in the archive to get more details about that. But just to say, the Christian side tries to excuse this letter from that point, and then the skeptic side comes in over here and says, well, that 2nd century agenda to push women, that's a more sexist concept. That's actually the reverse. I can't believe intelligent scholars, and some of which I have some respect for, make that argument. I was on a channel recently, on an atheist channel, and I saw this come up about 5 or 6 times in the comments section of the live stream. I couldn't believe it. I was blown away that somebody was making that argument. And I looked over at the notes that I was looking at from the Gnostic text, and I'm thinking to myself, women being praised in the Christian culture, and what I mean by Christian is I don't mean Orthodox, I mean the Gnostic Christian culture, because Gnostics would associate themselves with the teachings of Jesus and would associate themselves with the rise of these teachings of women priests. Women priests were first ordained in the Christian world, outside of the pagan world, in the Christian world, in the 2nd century, in the rise of Gnostic groups. So again, people trying to say, oh, well, that makes Paul's letters to Timothy and Titus completely 2nd century. Well, again, I'm going to show why that's not possible. But on the other hand of that, there is an argument to be made. But one of those arguments that I'm making is that these things were in the proto stage. He wasn't dealing with it necessarily from a Gnostic view of women ordination, although that ends up becoming a problem, and the churches start using this kind of language to combat the women priesthood. But it's interesting that if you look at those who go up against women priests in the church and the statements they make of it, they hardly ever go to 1 Timothy. They rarely use that verse. They use other concepts to combat that idea. But there was a need through the Gnostic reforms that women started becoming priestesses in churches, if you would, following in suit with pagan practices of the ancient past. But it was an issue in all the churches as to what is the role between male and female since they are one in Christ. In fact, it is Paul that said that. It's neither Jew nor Greek, male or female. They are one in Christ. So why the need for this statement? He was setting the boundaries of what the priesthood and the liturgical practice of the church should functionally look like, which is compatible with what we see in the Old Testament. While other nations had priestesses and their goddesses and things like that, the nation of Israel did not have women in the priesthood or in the Levitical system to do the work of the ministry. There were women at the temple and doing work in the temple, but not in that way. So the pattern is there. So these arguments are insufficient to say, well, see, that's 2nd century language. Not really, because he's not attacking the very issues in which they are presented in the 2nd century, where we see other church fathers come in and attack it viciously and head on. Paul would have been far more vicious at attacking the doctrine of Gnosticism if it is full-fledged the way it is in the 2nd century. The way that they were abusing the office of clergy, he would have been far more aggressive, like we see in a book like Romans, or in a book like Galatians, or in his attacks against faulty practices like the Church of Corinth. He's not that way in this letter. Very, very different. It's just something to consider. Let's carry on. Origen in his Contra Celsum, book 163, says, moreover, Paul, who himself also at the latter time became an apostle of Jesus, says in his epistle to Timothy, this is a faithful saying, that Jesus Christ came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am chief. Once again, we see in these writings that Origen believed, along with Clement of Alexandria, along with the Muratorian fragment, Irenaeus, that these are without a doubt the writings of the Apostle Paul. Jerome, in letter 53, said the Apostle Paul writes to Timothy, who had been trained in the holy writings from the child, exhorting him to study them diligently. That's in 2 Timothy 3. And not to neglect the gift which was given to him by the laying on of hands of the presbytery. That's 1 Timothy 4:14. To Titus, he gives commandments that among the bishops, other virtues which he briefly describes, he should be careful to seek a knowledge of the scriptures. A bishop, he says, must hold fast the faithful word as he has been taught, that he may be able by sound doctrine both to exhort and to convince the gainsayers, which is a quote of Titus 1:9. Jerome clearly believed that 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus are Paul's writings. And the instructions, once again, consistent with what we saw earlier, used for ecclesiastical doctrine and discipline. And he gives formation of that. Now let's talk about its early usage in the church. Once more, why it can't be 2nd century. Well, for one, first Clement. Some tried to date Clement much, much earlier than the late 1st century. I don't buy it. I think 90 to 98 is a very fair date. I think it's between 96 and 98 personally. Clement of Rome quotes 1 Timothy 1:17, Titus 3:1. Okay? It can't be quoting something that wasn't invented yet. If forgers are coming along in the 2nd century, he's writing in the 1st century, logic tells us that the thing he is quoting precedes his quote, unless he's a time traveler. Polycarp to the Philippians, the only reason I bring this one up is because he was brought up earlier as a person who confronted Marcion in an argument for the pastorals and following and practicing them right. Well, in his little short letter to the Philippians, does he ever use the pastorals? Boy, does he ever. He uses Timothy 1st and 2nd more than once. He quotes 2 Timothy 2:12, 2 Timothy 4:1, 2 Timothy 4:10, 1 Timothy 2:2, 1 Timothy 6:7, and 1 Timothy 6:10. And a short letter, 6 pastoral citations. Who is teaching Irenaeus? Who ran into Marcion? Who Irenaeus understood like, hey, this guy Marcion should be completely avoided because Timothy was told by Paul not to keep company with somebody who's been rebuked more than twice for heresy. To me, this is interesting. So let's talk about the numbers. The main argument that people make is the whole consensus of scholars say today that the pastoral epistles are not Pauline. See, I made mention of this on Jacob Burnham's channel, History Valley. You can go see that interview. I cover these same slides. But one of the things I pointed out is that the community of skeptics for years continue to chant this line. The consensus of scholars say this. The consensus of scholars say that. Here's the problem. Most of the time, there's never been a consensus, and there's never been a definition of that consensus, meaning where are we starting the consensus from? Today? The last 10 years? The last 100 years? For the entirety of the church's existence? Because if we're doing consensus, the idea that Paul didn't write these is in a fringe minority across the history of the church. This is the post-Enlightenment idea. This is more modern lingo. That's all it is. More criticism against Paul and more criticism against the New Testament. No one believed this before the post-Enlightenment era. Nobody. Everyone. Jew, Greek, Christian, all understood these to be Paul's letters. Okay? It wasn't until the rise of smarter people, apparently, that know better than people back then have come up with reasons through crazy ideas and schemes as to why this can't be Paul, because it's different. It's got different syntax. It's got different language. And by the way, consensus does not equal truth. There's Christians that are in a consensus on stuff that are just dead wrong. They're just wrong. Consensus is not the definitive answer of all things that gives us all truth. Consensuses are ever changing and constantly having to be revised because people change their minds and new data comes in. And what's ironic is a lot of traditional thoughts are coming back into the arguments again. In the British New Testament Conference, they did a survey, a real consensus that actually has real numbers and votes. And it was on the pastoral authorship. Or on the Pauline authorship, which include the Pastoral Epistles, which I'm going to show you. The data here is extraordinary. Now, my friend Elijah Hickson, who's one of the producers of the book, Myths and Mistakes of New Testament Textual Criticism, along with Dr. Peter Gurry. Dr. Hickson and Dr. Gurry together worked and put together a wonderful book. I highly recommend if you're interested in textual criticism and the rise of how the New Testament was created, to go and read that along with Dr. John Mead and Timothy Mitchell and a lot of great guys in that book. But he sent me this data from a British New Testament conference, all PhDs, conservatives, liberals, it's everybody. This isn't like a bunch of evangelicals meeting in Texas, okay? This is the top of the line scholars coming together to discuss Pauline authorship. And when you look at the numbers, it's not as lopsided as everybody wants you to think. For example, we don't see any surprise on Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Galatians. 109 votes say it's Paul. 0 say, I don't, there's nobody that gives Paul out of this. Like, no, there's somebody else named Joe or something. Nobody there believed anybody else was ascribed to these letters but Paul. And then there's a category for uncertain, zeros across the uncertain lines for those. Ephesians was to my shock. Most people would say in modern scholarship today that Ephesians is a disputed pseudo-Pauline letter. 39 said they think it's Paul. 42 say no. But 28 said, we're not willing to write this off and say it's not Paul. Could be. Maybe, maybe not. If you take the uncertains with the yes, the majority are saying it's possible that it's Paul. This one is funny to me. Philippians 108-1 with 0 in the uncertain. I'd love to know what weirdo in that crowd put no for Philippians when that one is hardly ever disputed by anybody. But oddly enough, somebody did put no. Maybe they got their ballot upside down on that one and accidentally put no when they meant to put yes. Who knows? Colossians was a shock as well. Very shocking. 56 said, yes, it's Paul. 17 said no. 36 said uncertain. That is a massive turnaround from what people say is the consensus of Colossians. My theory is because the language of Colossians is so close to Philemon, which has 108 yeses to 0 no's and 1 uncertain. Thessalonians 109-0. 2 Thessalonians 63 said, yes, I think it's Paul. 13 said no. 35 said uncertain. I was also very surprised by that one because many dispute 2 Thessalonians. Hebrews 0 Paul. 100 said no. 9 said uncertain. Now that, folks, is what a consensus looks like. Now let's take a look at the pastorals. 1 Timothy 23 say yes, 59 say no. People go, see? 23-59, that's pretty lopsided. But look at the uncertains. 25. If you take the 25 uncertains and you put that together with those that say, yes, I think it's Paul, you have 48-59. Is the majority still saying, no, it's not Paul? Yes, you do. You have the majority. But is that really a lopsided consensus? 48 saying it's possible to 59 saying no. 2 Timothy grows. 26 say yes. 58 say no. 24 say maybe. Then Titus is 25 say yes. 62 say no. 21 say maybe. Yeah, it's not the majority. But it's not as lopsided of this consensus like we see for something like in favor of Romans or in favor of Philippians or in favor of not being Pauline to Hebrews. This is major when we're looking at consensus, because it's not as lopsided as everybody on the other side wants us to believe that it is, because a real consensus has not even been done. Now, I want to make mention of this because I've seen some comments here, and I just want to be careful to clarify here. I do not personally believe Paul wrote the pastorals by hand. So when we say these belong to Paul, can that only mean he wrote it? No. See, here's the thing. You can have an author of a letter, and that looks a couple of ways. He can author it and write it, right? You can also have an author who is telling an amanuensis to write it under what's called dictation. That is true of the book of Romans, for example. I, Tertius, wrote this letter. But yet at the very beginning, it says it's Paul. So Paul is clearly doing the words, and Tertius is writing them for him. In fact, I think it's very rare that Paul even wrote letters, possibly 2 or 3 at the most. I find it intriguing that when he says, I wrote this with my own hand, almost as if that was not the standard or something. I think that when you deal with the subject of who's the author, we need to unravel that a little bit and not be so general, because the author who is both thinking the words and writing them, and the author who's thinking the words and having somebody else write them, are still, that person is still the author. Let me give you a third category to add to that. You could have someone who authorizes a text and gives the scribe freedom to write. For example, if Paul is in prison and he's writing these letters, but he doesn't have the ability to do so, his eyes apparently are bad, something seems like that, or he hasn't the liberty to do it while in prison, here's what he can do. He has people with him. He mentions them by name pretty regularly. One of them is Luke, who is very, very capable of writing, who, by the way, I think is the writer of the Epistle of Hebrews. And I think Paul authorized that letter to be written. So I don't think Paul wrote Hebrews. I think he authorized Hebrews. I think somebody else did. I did an entire episode on that. You got to go way back in the archives, probably in the first 20 episodes I've ever done on the podcast. I don't even think it's on the YouTube. If you're listening to this on YouTube, you're probably not going to find it because this is before we were on YouTube. I give a whole defense of the authorship of the book of Hebrews. Now, not to be distracted by Hebrews, come back to the pastorals. Paul could easily tell somebody like Luke, who's with him, Luke, I need you to write a letter for me. I need it to be sent, 1 to Timothy, 1 to Titus, and then maybe later he has him do this again to Timothy for a second letter. And he says something like this. I need you to say these words. I need you to make sure this is included. Luke can write this thing up, do even a rough draft, show it to Paul, and Paul say, can you take that out or add this in? Or Paul says, yeah, I like it. Let's send that. That is still an authorized letter of Paul because Luke is writing it on behalf of Paul or whoever. It could be Silas or could be Linus or whoever. I mean, we don't know. So when you're looking at authority, what makes the text apostolic is not the penman, but the authority behind the penman. Meaning, if the penman is working independent of the authorities, it is not scripture. It is not seen as apostolic. It is seen as a forgery, or at least, at the worst, a forgery. But at best, it is seen as somebody just trying to do something helpful but messing things up. I believe, personally, that Paul did not pen the pastorals. And I don't even necessarily hold that he did this writing with dictation. It wouldn't shock me if he did, but I don't think it's necessarily dictation. I think Paul gave somebody liberty to write these letters for him, and he simply approved them, making them Pauline. They are under the authority of Paul. Now, here's why I also don't buy the syntactical argument. I'm going to show one more slide that I think will help us. One of the things that I've come to realize when it comes to the arguments today, most are geared around, oh, the syntax is different. The language is different in the pastorals. Do you remember what the Muratorian fragment said? And do you remember how it separated the pastorals with Philemon from the rest of the general letters sent to the actual churches themselves, the general corporation? I thought to myself when reading the Muratorian fragment, this is about 3-4 years ago now. I thought to myself, I wonder, with what the Muratorian fragment just said, he wrote it out of affection and love. If we are comparing everything wrong, trying to compare the writings of 1st Timothy and Titus to Galatians or Corinthians or Romans or 1st Thessalonians, maybe that's not the way we should be doing this. Maybe we should find something more comparable. Philemon's a personal letter. It's in the separate category with the Muratorian fragment, and it's also written out of endearment, love, and affection. So maybe we should stop comparing it to general letters. Think about it. If I'm writing an email to my colleagues, it's going to be a lot different, especially if it's instructive and rebuking and correcting and calling out errors. That's going to look a lot different in vocabulary and syntax than me writing an email to my son who I haven't seen in 6 months, who's far away. It's going to look very different. So I decided to do all the textual work and find out, can I reconstruct the book of Philemon with the language of the Pastoral Epistles? Let's see. I've got this pulled up on my screen. Hopefully it is visible enough. I might zoom in one more. Let's see. That'll be good. Look at the first line here, for example. So I took all the words, major words, what you see in red. Red is that these words are in the pastorals or phrases. Blue is they're not in the pastorals. Green is the root words in the pastorals, meaning the language exists in that vocabulary, but how it was used may be different. So I kind of neutralized them. So I decided to go through this verse by verse. Look at verse number 1, for example. Paul, that's easy. He's in 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus. Then he mentions that he is a desmion. He is a prisoner. This is claiming in Philemon that Paul is in prison. Well, we just so happen to have that same exact word used in 2 Timothy 1:8. Then we have a clause here, together as a genitive noun, for Christ Jesus. Now, notice what I didn't do. I didn't just I didn't do small words like conjunctions like kai and def or and but and also. And I didn't do stuff like that. Or prepositions like gar for the word for. Like I didn't do that. I made sure to separate these where everybody uses words, not to count those. Only words that are actually significant. This is a whole phrase. I didn't just do Jesus. I didn't just do Christ. And I didn't just do for. For Christ Jesus. That together as a genitive noun is used very frequently in the pastorals. 1 Timothy 1:1, 1 Timothy 1:2, 4:6, 5:21, 6:13, 2 Timothy 1, 2 Timothy 1:10, 2 Timothy 2:3, Titus 1:4, Titus 2:3. Notice the blue here, the variant where there is no mention. It's Philemon. No shock. I mean, there's a personal name and a personal letter. Very unlikely he'd show up in one of the pastorals. Same thing in verse 2. You have Aphia, which is probably his wife, but notice he calls him our sister. This is used in the plural form, same word, 1 Timothy 5:2. He also mentions that he is a fellow soldier. Now, this is two terms placed into one. However, the concept of a soldier, which is used in 2 Timothy 2:3, 2 Timothy 2:4, is very common in that kind of language where Paul's encouraging his young preacher boy, if you would, to maintain a certain conduct as a good soldier of Jesus Christ. He uses the same terminology in the pastorals. Obviously, the church, no shock there either. And then he mentions in your house, specifically oikon. The word oikon is used in 1 Timothy 5:4, 2 Timothy 4:19, other forms of 1 Timothy 3:4, 3:5, 3:12, 3:15, 2 Timothy 1:16, Titus 1:11. All the way down, folks. I mean, we're not going to go through all these. All the way down. You see this over and over and over. And I did the total math. 7 major words, like in this verse here, verse 14. 6 are red, meaning 6 of them are in the pastorals, with a total usage of 17 times in the pastorals. 1 green, which means it's neutral due to its unique usage of Philemon alone, and no blue at all. The whole entire verse can be reconstructed with the language alone. So you go down here and you do the math, and what do you come up with? I did this a long time ago. This is what I've come up with. There's 162 major words and phrases in the book of Philemon. If you take these and you break them down into their color coordinated, how many are in the pastorals directly? 131 of those 162. How many are not in there? 23. How many are kind of neutral? 8. Out of the 23 blue, 6 are names, and the 8 green are neutral, meaning you can argue for or against. So if we subtract them out of that, that's a total of 14. So 162 minus 14. Let's say we're working now officially with 148 actual definitive terms. So you have these names, and then you have these neutrals, and you move them. We're now 148. We do the math, and I even took out, for the sake of conservatism, I removed 3 names that were in the red, Paul and Timothy and Demas. I moved them out, even though they're found in both. So that way it is even. I moved out the blue names. I moved out the red names, so that we're just focusing on words. 145 are now what we're working with. You divide that by the 128 total differences between red and blue. That leads you with 88%, meaning you can reconstruct 88% of the book of Philemon with the language of the pastoral epistles. 88% of Philemon can be reconstructed with the language and syntax of the pastoral epistles. Why is that important? It's important because it goes to show that we're comparing the wrong things when we say, that's not Paul, the syntax is different, the language and vocab is different. Well, if we're comparing it to Galatians, yeah. There's a lot, and it's not as different as people think, okay? There's a lot of connections in the pastorals with Colossians, which is very close to Philemon as well. Which is why I don't buy this, you accept Philemon, reject Colossians. So if this is true, that we're doing this wrong, and I think the Muratorian fragment gave us the greatest hint to look at this different, to look at this not as a all-encompassing letters of Paul, but look at how Paul wrote to Philemon, to Timothy, and to Titus through love and affection. Do we see these kinds of terminology? Now, what I did in that same document is I left that document and I took exclusive words like son. I love how Paul endearingly entreats Timothy and Titus as sons in the faith. That's that affection. That's that love that was just talked about. When you're looking at Paul and you're looking at his disposition, it's changed. Instead of like, who bewitched you in Galatians, or double-minded people that he's going after in Corinthians, calling them carnal. Are you not carnal? He says, this is majorly different because the cause and reason and the rise for all this is different in of itself. So these things are incredible to me as you look at his disposition in treating Timothy and Titus. He also calls Onesimus in Philemon his son. Teknon is the Greek word. One used a lot by the Apostle John, 1 John. Teknon and teknos. But here, and only here in Philemon and in the pastorals, does he ever call someone his son. There are 8 unique phrases that are only in Philemon. We don't throw it out. And there are 6 connections. I have 6 connections that are unique to only the pastorals and Philemon out of all those words. 6 connections in the pastorals and Philemon that are unique to those books and not anywhere else in Paul's writings. We can reconstruct it. To me, I argue that these are Pauline, whether by a scribe who was under dictation or free to write a letter for him by his request. All right. That is the episode on Did Paul Write the Pastoral Epistles? If this is your first time listening to Facts, thanks for tuning into this episode. Make sure you hit that like and subscribe button. Make sure you follow us on new episodes. If you're listening on the audio on one of your 7 favorite platforms for the podcast, please make sure you follow us so that new episodes are released and you are getting notifications of those as well. If you are joining us, you've been joining us for a while now, and you like our content, I've received numerous emails and messages on social media. The encouragement has been at an all-time high. I'm very appreciative of all of you who have come out and done that, been very kind in your words and encouraging and asking questions. I encourage you to keep doing that. But if you'd like to get behind Facts, we are 501c3. We just had a board meeting 2 weeks ago. We're about to launch a website in 2026. We want to have a store for merchandise because that's what you guys have been asking for. We're working on that. All this is going on behind the scenes. None of this is free. Some of you have partnered behind us. There is a link in the description where you can give towards Facts once or twice or every month, even $5, $10. Some of you do that. You'll get newsletters. You're a part of updates that go on. You'll also be the first to be notified of certain content that is released. Make sure you see that link there if you want to do that. That'd be a huge encouragement. And it's even a tax write-off, for goodness sakes. Why not take care of that, right? So if you want to partner us in that way, please do that. It'll be a huge, huge help to us as we continue to grow the ministry. And we're speaking at churches and at conferences and at schools and things like that. We're getting a lot of opportunities, and we're thankful for that. We're also thankful for you. And as always, grace and peace to you. God bless.